The concept of just war is kind of interesting because you don't really just have to justify. The concept of justice doesn't apply, say, to this delicious dinner we just ate. Nobody said that was a just dinner or unjust dinner. So justice applies to actions which are killing, which a war is, of mass killing. And obviously, since acts of killing are grave actions, they have to be justified in some way, vindicated or justified. Much of what I call classical international law theory, which was developed by the Catholic scholastics, especially the 16th century Spanish scholastics such as Vittoria and Suarez, and then by the Dutch Protestant scholastics, Grotius, and by 18th and 19th century jurists up until the First World War, much of their literature is developing the criteria of a just war. What is a just war? What is an unjust war? And my own view can be simplified very quickly. In my view, a just war exists when a people tries to ward off the threat of coercion or domination by another people, or to overthrow an already existing domination. That's a just war, from my point of view. A war is unjust, on the other hand, when the people try to impose domination on another people, or try to retain an already existing coercive rule over them. That's a fairly simple, I think, and direct criteria. Now, I admit there is some room for fuzzy interpretation of what constitutes a menace of impending domination that might justify going to war. On one extreme, you can see a guy looking across the street at you, looking cross-eyed, you decide to shoot him because he might be evil, have evil intentions. So you don't want to go that far. So what is the criterion for an impending or threat? My own preference, as always, is for strict construction. In other words, to adopt a famous criterion in another context, in my view, to justify preemptive strike, the impending threat of force must be clear and present. So in other words, guys just about raising his gun to shoot at you, that's a clear and present danger. Anything else, I think, is illegitimate. In my view, almost every war engaged in by the United States of America since its birth has been unjust. And I can't deal with that tonight. In pursuit of the unjust goal of coercive domination over other peoples, or at very best conjuring up alleged threats that have scarcely been either clear or present. I've had a reputation as an anti-war activist because in my own lifetime, my ideological activism has been generally focused in opposition to America's wars. First, because I believe our waging them to be unjust, and secondly, because war, and the famous phrase that I think somebody brought up this weekend, I forget who, of libertarian Randall Bourne, who says war has always been the health of the state. It's the instrument for aggrandizing state power over the health, the lives, the prosperity of their subject citizens and the social institutions. So even a just war can't be entered into lightly, and an unjust war, of course, has to be anathema. Some people have thought I've been a pacifist because I've been opposed to wars, but surely an odd kind of pacifist, for example, who champions the death penalty for violent criminals as well as caning for vandals. Not your common garden variety pacifist. The point is, I think that there are two wars in American history that I think have been unquestionably proper and just. And not only that, the opposing side was clearly unjust and notably unjust. There's not even any question of it in my mind. These two wars have been where there's been a threat. Well, these two wars, you didn't have to worry about a future threat. In these two wars, in both of these wars, Americans are trying to rid themselves of unwanted domination by another people. You didn't have to worry about does he represent a threat or not. It's right there. And in both cases, the other side ferociously trying to maintain their coercive rule over Americans who wanted to rule themselves. In each case, our side, if you will, one side was notably just, the other side unjust. These two just wars in American history have been the American Revolution and the War for Southern Independence. At this point, I'd like to mention just a few vital features of the treatment of war by classical international lawyers. Not just, one, they dealt with just wars. This is a war, just and unjust. The other aspect of what they were dealing with is what are the limitations on war? Should war be unlimited? And even a just war. And the classical international law tradition, which is which ruled from, say, 16th century until 1914, what they were trying to do is this. They said, look, we don't try to abolish war. That's ridiculous, utopian, idiotic. It's not going to happen. What we try to do is, if there are wars, we're trying to limit their scope. Okay. The limitations were twofold. One, don't target civilians. A key. Keep civilians out of it. If you want to fight, if the king wants to fight with another king, go out there with your retinue and fight each other. Keep civilians out of it. Number one. And number two, neutrals' rights. Other countries not only are permitted to stand off if country A and country B are fighting. Not only is it permissible for other countries to remain neutral, but it's a good thing. Neutrality was considered great in the old days. It was considered noble and just. And neutrals had rights. And most of international law was working out the details of this. For example, if country A and country B were fighting with each other, country C was trying to trade with either one of them, could not be interfered with. The enemy countries could not interfere with shipping goods to the other side. The only thing they could interfere with was contraband, which was very narrowly defined as arms and ammunition. And that's it. I mean, not just food and medical supplies, but anything else, industrial raw material, everything, capital goods, machinery, that has to pass. You could not blockade and keep out neutrals' rights. So this, of course, meant that every side, every country expected to be in one time or another neutral. They wanted to preserve their rights. They didn't want to be international pariahs for the rest of the centuries. And so more or less these principles are observed, at least during the 19th century. And observed more and more over time. This was considered the laws of civilized warfare, limiting warfare. Don't target civilians and keep neutrals out of it. Allow neutrals to proceed. So this in the old days, for example, as I say, neutrality was considered not just justifiable but a positive virtue. In the old days, he kept us out of war. It was a high tribute to a president or any political leader. But now, of course, all the pundits and professors condemn any president who, quote, stands idly by, unquote, while, quote, people are being killed, unquote, in Bosnia, Somalia, Rwanda, you fill in the blanks, any place in the world. In the old days, standing idly by was considered an act of high statesmanship. And as I say, neutrals had rights. You couldn't interfere with neutrals. So, in modern international law, we have a very different situation, starting with Woodrow Wilson, the evil Woodrow Wilson, continuing on since. Both of these, by the way, criteria, both of these modern law criteria developed by Wilson. And one of them is that the so-called collective security against aggression. You figure out, this countries fighting each other all the time, there's wars all the time. Let's say the Hutus and the Tutsis in Rwanda and Burundi. It's a good laboratory case. First you figure out who the aggressor is. Who the hell knows? I mean, they could both be aggressors, right? No. You gotta figure out who the good guy is and who the bad guy is. There always has to be only one bad guy. Because if both guys are bad, you're not gonna get the whole world to march in and shoot somebody. Okay? There has to be one clear aggressor and the other clear victims, and then the whole world's supposed to leap in and crush the aggressor. The model of this was the cop on the corner. This is the famous idea of the international police force. The League of Nations, the UN, the US, NATO, whatever other collective security, whatever alphabet arrangement they've got. So the idea is if a war breaks out somewhere, first you find who the bad guys are. How the hell do you know? They say that they're thousands of miles away from the action. Who knows? You get some CNN TV camera coming in, you shoot somebody in action, you figure out who the bad guys are, and then you come in and zap them, bomb them, crush them, send troops in, and all that. It's all very soul-satisfying, conceptually easy. There are, however, certain problems with this. In the first place, what's aggression? I mean, the cop on the corner, if you see somebody mugging somebody else, it's pretty clear who the aggressor is. The cop comes in and zaps the mugger. Okay, it's simple. In international relations, it's not that easy. Who knows what the just boundary is? Who knows whether the Rwanda-Burundi border should be this way through some lake or the north of some lake or whatever? It's not that clear. Also, the boundary shifts a lot through history. So the boundary now could be very different from the boundary 10 years from now. Which is the just boundary? Who knows? Who cares? Why should everybody get involved in this? So the whole idea of the classical international law is to limit warfare, keep everybody out, limit civilians, and limit the other people. So the rest of the world could go about its business, and the wars will be, you can't abolish war, but you can at least confine it to small areas. And that was a wonderful point. With Wilsonianism, you have a very different situation. As I say, one is you have to find the aggressor and then zap him. The interesting thing, for example, in Bosnia, it's very interesting. You have to demonize one group, okay? In order to get the American suckers to intervene and the rest of the United Nations and all that, you have to have one evil demon. So the Serbs were nominated as the evil demon very early, and everybody, Serbs are evil, they're ethnic cleansing, they're killing people, killing civilians and all that. But then it turns out the Croats and the Bosnians were also killing people, and they got a chance, killing civilians. That muddied the waters a little bit. See, that confused the Americans. Who's going to march in and send troops and bombers and all that if all sides are somehow bad? That's not going to fly. So the warmongers have to create a situation where the Serbs are pure evil. Somehow the devil has anointed them as evil. Everybody else are good and victims and wonderful and believers of freedom and democracy and all the other crap. And that's so in other words, they have to know nothing about foreign policy to really fall for this stuff, which of course most Americans don't. Which leaves a gap in the situation. So that's the one Wilsonian, vicious, pernicious Wilsonian argument, that you have to find the aggressor and zap him. Okay. The other, of course, argument is, Wilsonian argument, you have to, in the United States and every other country, you've got to impose democracy and human rights throughout the world. This is even worse in a sense. In other words, you've got now a situation where, democracy and human rights don't exist very many places in the world. I don't want to disillusion many people here, but there's very few places. Very few places we have this situation. But now it's the God-given assignment for the United States to go and impose democracy throughout the world, everywhere, every place, regardless. So now you have Charles Beard, somebody mentioned that this weekend too. Charles Beard said that the policy of stamping out aggression, collective security against aggression, is a policy of perpetual war for perpetual peace. In the pursuit of world perpetual peace, you have to keep fighting constantly. Now you have the other part of the equation, the perpetual war to impose human rights and democracy everywhere. And now you have a formula for total, unending loss of treasure and life and every that. Every conflict all over the globe in a totally impossible quest. In addition to that, the idea of using war, of imposing democracy and human rights by the sword is kind of odd anyway. And the Somalian intervention, to me, is a beautiful case study of this. To me, it's perfect. If you remember, it's a Wilsonian dream in practice. So you have a situation, and the entire left, by the way, loved it. They loved the Somalian intervention because there was no American interest at all, conceivable interest in Somalia. Nothing. No resources, no fight against communism, nothing. Zippo. Okay. No strategic sea routes, whatever. They couldn't find anything. So the left, the allegedly anti-war left, they all love the Somalian intervention because it was, quote, purely altruistic, unquote. Because America has no interest in it, therefore it's good. That was to me it's totally bizarre. The whole culture is crazy, and that's part of it. So now we have, when the Somalian intervention came in, we extolled, if you remember the press in that period, for a few heady months, they extolled a new kind of army, what we can call a new model army, basis apologies to Cromwell, engaging in a new kind of high moral intervention. The U.S. soldier with a care package on one hand and a gun on the other. So we're bringing food and peace and human rights to the masses, meantime we're bringing a gun. So that we're bringing democracy and peace and human rights to the benighted peoples of Somalia and doing it nobly and altruistically. Well, it worked for about 2 months, if it worked that much. And then, of course, everything hits the fan. The consequences show up. And we wind up with every Somalian virtually hating the United States, shooting American soldiers, dragging their bodies through the streets and all that. Fortunately, we got out. I don't know if this is by some luck. The United States got out. I think CNN, or the pictures of the bodies being dragged to the streets didn't quite have the effect it was supposed to, and Americans were revolted against the whole process and got out. So we have, now the interesting thing in both cases here, in both of these cases, the modern interventionists, the warmongers, the modern international law people, have won by seizing the moral high ground, very much like the environmentalists do it. It's very similar. The environmentalists, they speak for the cosmos. They speak for the rights of beaches and trees and insects and whatever, and we're just narrow human being types. Yeah, right? So they speak for the earth and everything else. And similarly here, we speak for narrow, selfish American interests. They speak for the war for democracy and human rights and peace and unending peace and all that. So they were able to seize the high moral ground, and apparently they were not successfully challenged on this. In the old days, that wasn't true. In the old days, if you're an interventionist or warmonger, You're considered a propagandist for despotism, for mass murder, for perpetual war, and a spokesman for the merchants of death, a great phrase that should be revived. So a warmonger was not considered a high moral person somehow. But nowadays, of course, it's pretty simple. You just go out, yes, we should kill all Serbs. This becomes the moral position. And those of us that don't want to kill all Serbs become selfish and narrow. At any rate, I bring up the cause of human rights, so-called, because this, of course, is precisely the critical argument, which, at least in retrospect, Father Abraham's war of northern aggression against the South is justified and even glorified. The humanitarian, again with a gun, with butchery in his wake, rights the wrongs of slavery by mass murder, destruction of property institutions, and wreaking havoc, which has still not disappeared. Isabel Patterson, one of the great essays on political philosophy of this century, zeroed in on what she aptly called the humanitarian or the guillotine. Those of us who read my review on Chronicles, I apologize for repeating it. I think this is great stuff. As she wrote, the humanitarian wishes, quote, wishes to be a prime mover in the lives of others. He cannot admit either the divine or the natural order by which men have the power to help themselves. The humanitarian puts himself in the place of God, unquote. But Mrs. Patterson notes the humanitarian is, quote, confronted by two awkward facts. First, that the competent do not need his assistance. And second, that the majority of the people, if unperverted, positively do not want to be done good by the humanitarian. Unquote. Having considered what the good of others might be and who is to decide on the good and on what to do about it, Mrs. Patterson points out, quote, of course what the humanitarian actually proposes is that he shall do what he thinks is good for everybody. It is at this point that the humanitarian sets up a guillotine. And she concludes the humanitarian in theory is a terrorist in action, which is exactly it, point by point, right down the line. Most of my friends and colleagues are hesitant to concede the existence of universal natural rights. I believe in natural rights. But I think one of the problems is they worry they might find themselves forced to support American or worldwide intervention to try to enforce these rights everywhere. But I think the resolution of this is the classical natural law international jurists, they weren't in favor of universal collective security or enforcement of rights. If, for example, Tutsis are slaughtering Hutus in Rwanda, or vice versa, the natural lawyers would have said, look, it's too bad, it violates the natural rights of the Hutus or Tutsis, but that doesn't mean anybody else should leap in to do something about it. Quite the contrary. We might encapsulate this position into a slogan. This is my slogan for the night. Rights may be universal, but their enforcement must be local. Or to adopt the motto of the Irish rebels, Sinn Féin, ourselves alone. We want to enforce our rights, we should do it ourselves. We're not going to expect everybody else to do it for us. We've got rights, we've got to do something about it. This, of course, was the American revolutionaries. The American revolutionaries were happy to accept French aid, but they were prepared to, they pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to do it themselves. Take up arms for their rights. They didn't expect the whole world of therapists and everybody else to do it for them. So, to put it another way, I mentioned environmentalists a minute ago. I've always believed that when the loony left claims that all sorts of entities have rights, animals, alligators, trees, plants, rocks, beaches, the earth, the ecology, quote unquote, the proper response is, okay, when those entities act like Americans in the American Revolution, they set forth their declaration, and then they take up arms to support their rights, then I can take them seriously. Otherwise, shut up. Let's now turn to America's two just wars. It's plainly evident to me that the American Revolution was a just war. It was a war of peoples forming an independent nation and casting off the bonds of another people, insisting on perpetuating rule over them. Obviously, the Americans, while welcoming French support, decided to do it on their own. What I want to stress here is not so much the grievances, which are mostly taxation and whatever stems from it, but the grounds on which they stood for this solemn act of separation. The political philosophy in those days, the old-fashioned political philosophy, which was getting obsolete by the 18th century, was that the king is sovereign, the king has divine powers, everybody else is subordinate to the king, and any rebellion against the king is evil and satanic. This was basically the theory of order. That wasn't working too well in the United States, especially in America. But even so, even with the, I should say, the conservative natural, that was the theory of order. That's divine sovereignty, and that's it. Among the contractual theorists, natural law theorists, Hugo Grotius and other Grotians were conservative. They believed that people were originally sovereign. They delegated their powers to the king way back, as some listy would. But then it's perpetual. Then the king has to keep it forever, and they can't get it back. This seems to me, and seems to other more radical natural rights people, as being inconsistent. And so Father Juan de Mariana, one of my favorite people in history of political thought, Spanish Jesuit scholastic, John Locke and his followers, they said, no, look, if we delegated our powers to the king and the king turns out to be a bad guy and violates his trust, we can take it back. Why can't we take these powers back? So the theory, and this was essentially the theory of the American revolutionaries, that we delegated certain powers to the king, he violated it, we're taking it back. It was a contractual theory of government. Government by the just consent of the governed and not by some divine sovereignty. Now, whether or not you agree with that, it seems to me the American Revolution was founded on that principle. That this is a contractual compact theory of government. And interestingly enough, by the way, as is well known, it was a big psychological thing for the American Revolutionaries to break with the king. The Parliament they didn't give a damn about. Parliament they hated, and that was it. Remember, the Declaration of Independence, there's almost no mention of Parliament. It's all the king. The king has done this, the king is evil, blah, blah, blah. But they had to break this cord with the king. It was a terrible thing for them. They had all taken oaths of allegiance to the king. The king was a real person. Unlike the so-called Union, which I'll come to in a minute, the king was real. Okay, so they had to break with the king. It was a powerful problem with it, and Tom Paine's common sense essentially did that. In the terms of the New Left, Paine's common sense desanctified and delegitimatized the king. He said, the king of Great Britain, Tom Paine wrote, is only the descendant of, quote, nothing better than the principal ruffian of some restless gang, whose savage manner of preeminence and subtlety obtained him the title of chief among plunderers, unquote. And now he said the kings are, the royal brood of Great Britain are but crowned ruffians. Okay, this was a powerful thing for Americans, for American psychology. And they enabled them to break, and they only broke with the king about a year after the war started. The American Revolution started in spring of 1775, and only by July 76 they were able to make the break. Okay, so government, the American Republic is founded on contractual and withdrawing consent from the king, from the government. Now what happens is that the 13 colonies, each of the 13 colonies formed 13 separate contractual republics. Each of them based on libertarian doctrine, on classical republican models. In each case, they set up independent sovereign states with powers of government strictly limited. I think the first time in human history had a written constitution whose purpose was to strictly limit the powers of the government. The powers are reserved to the people, the checks and balances and everything else they're trying to limit. They're very suspicious of all government power, even local government power. They want to keep it limited, keep their eye on it at all times and zap it whenever it gets strong. And each of the 13 republics did that. So then, of course, the 13 separate republics, having done this, have been making this fantastic break. Britain formed representatives of the Continental Congress, and they formed a confederation to help them fight the war, with severely limited central powers. Then they decided, after about a decade later, to scrap the Articles of Confederation, adopt a new constitution. Now, the very point, which should be emphasized more, the fact that the Articles of Confederation could be scrapped just like that, as a piece of paper, meant that it was not supposed to be perpetual. Okay, the 13 states said, okay, we think the Articles are now insufficient, whatever, and we're going to form a constitution. It'd be very peculiar to hold the American revolutionaries had repudiated their Pledge of Allegiance to a real king and then a couple of years later scrap the Articles of Confederation in order to sign up to adopt a constitution which they considered to be totally perpetual, like a one-way Venus flytrap. Once you adopt it, you're finished forever. You can't get out. Can you imagine the Constitution was hardly ratified as it was? I mean, the majority of the public is against the Constitution anyway. Can you imagine them doing it if they knew this was a one-way ticket to disaster, to suicide? Of course not. And so the idea that the Union was somehow perpetual and eternal is ridiculous. It's illogical and ridiculous. It violates the entire process by which the American republics were founded. Okay, so, and yet, of course, this is the illogic. This monstrous illogic is the argument of the North of why the South could not secede from the Union. That somehow, once the Act of adopting the Union was adopted or was created. It was a one-way ticket. That's it. As they say, kamikaze for sovereignty. In 1861, the Southern states, believing correctly that their cherished institutions were under grave threat, I think they were, and under assault from federal government, they decided to exercise their natural, contractual, and constitutional right to withdraw and secede from that union. And they came together in another confederation, the Confederated States of America. So if the American Revolutionary War is just, if we're prepared to say that, then we have to be prepared to say the Southern cause, the war for Southern independence, was also just, and equally so, and that the British, if the British were unjust, and I think they were, the Northern cause was also equally unjust. Now, of course, in neither case, in neither the American Revolution nor the Southern secession was the decision made for light or transient causes. In both cases, the courageous seceders pledged to each other their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. And as I say, if the Southern cause was wrong, then both North and South should have gone to the King of England with hat in hand and begged forgiveness and rejoined the empire. Okay, so now what about the grievances? I won't spend too much time on the grievances, but basically the American grievance was on taxes and different forms of taxes. The trial by jury question was really a question of because American juries would not convict so-called smugglers for disobeying British tariffs. The search warrants were searching for customs booty. It was all connected with taxes, and the Southern cause was also mostly connected with taxes, with high tariffs, as Lou Rockwell pointed out today, bleeding the South in order to create inefficient Northern manufacturers and shippers. So, and again, I don't want to go through this whole thing about taxes, but John C. Calhoun was a brilliant tax analyst. Essentially what he said was that the very existence of government, the very existence of taxation creates conflicting classes. This is not a Marxist theory of class struggle, it's a libertarian theory of class struggle. Namely, once you've got a government, some people are living off taxes and other people are paying it. Bureaucrats don't pay taxes. Guy who works for the government doesn't pay taxes. If he's getting a salary of $50,000 a year and pays $10,000 in taxes, he's getting a salary of $40,000. $10,000 is simply fiction. It's accounting fiction that justifies his existence to the rest of the poor public. Okay? One of the interesting things is, coming from New York as I do, the United Nations, the beloved United Nations, the bureaucrats there pay no taxes at all. And people are indignant. Yeah, they pay no taxes. It's great, but of course they're more candid about it than the United States government. You just don't pay taxes. The United States government, the accounting fiction is preserved. And so in zeroing in on the tariff as a key question, Calhoun pointed out, quote, the North has adopted a system of revenue and disbursements in which an undue proportion of the burden of taxation has been imposed on the South and an undue proportion appropriated to the North and for monopolization of Northern industry. Of course, we know that somebody mentioned again today, this week, the first South Carolina threat of nullification came about because of the Tariff of Abominations of 1828, the evil high tariff of 1828. Okay, what about the opposition of these two just wars? It seems to be plainly, evidently just. Both the opponents were unjust. The British, what was the British motivation? Okay, the British wanted to hold on to their empire. It's fairly clear why they wanted to hold on to the empire. They wanted to bleed the Americans. In a sense, it's coherent, at least. What were the motivations of the North? That's to me more interesting. Why, in the famous words of the abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, did not the North, quote, let their erring sisters go in peace? At least Garrison's original position before he got swept up in the war fever. Why did they let him go? Why did they let the South secede? What was the point? The driving force, again, I don't want to get too detailed, but the driving force of the North, the driving force for the war, is a group of people called the Yankees. Now, contrast to what most people think, Yankees not just people who lived in the North. The Yankees were a specific ethno-cultural group who started in New England, then spread. They're big, very mobile, the Yankees. They migrated to upstate New York to northern Indiana, northern Illinois, eastern Ohio, and places around the Great Lakes. And they were the major proponents of this stuff, abolitionism and general coercion. The Yankees had been swept up by a new form of Protestantism around 1830. A new form is we can call fanatical and emotional neo-Puritanism, driven by a fervent postmillennialism, which held that as a precondition for the second advent of Jesus Christ, man must set up a 1,000-year kingdom of God on earth. In order for Jesus to arrive, you have to have a 1,000-year kingdom God on earth set up by man. Okay, now what's the 1,000-year kingdom going to look like? Well, that's, of course, it's been contested. It's a little vague. But one thing is pretty clear. It has to be a perfect society. To be a 1,000-year kingdom, people have got to be perfect. How do you get perfect people? Well, there are different ways of going about it. And the Anabaptists in the 16th century, you slaughter all the heretics. That was the way you get perfect people. The perfect people are defined as those who are followers of XYZ, the Messiah. They slaughter everybody else, you have a perfect world, right? Right. Okay, so this is... the northern Yankees didn't exactly want to slaughter everybody right away because the immediate slaughter was sort of discredited from the 16th century on. What they want to do is to shape everybody else, stamp out sin, fairly gradually. Gradually doesn't mean really gradually. It means like, say, in 50 years. 50 years is always a sort of a big post-millennial thing. In 50 years, we'll set up the kingdom of God on earth. And very early in the game, the Yankees realized in order to do this, they have to turn the government to do it. You can't stamp out sin without government. Of course, the Yankees have always been in favor of government anyway. They're always itching for coercion. It was the Yankees that set up the first public school system in order to teach the kids civics and shape them up, to teach them obedience to the state. So they were primed for this anyway, and so they took to this as a duck takes to water. And Yankee evangelical postmillennialism essentially was this: and in order to, first of all, you have to stamp out sin to set up a kingdom. Second of all, if you don't do your best, your damnedest to stamp out sin, you will be damned. You can only achieve salvation by maximizing the occasion for salvation of everybody else. This meant these people were very energetic fanatics because they had to, they wanted to be saved themselves. In order to do that, they have to try to save everybody else. If the other people don't like it, you set up the guillotine. You set up the sword and fire. According to the Yankee doctrine, sin was very broadly defined. And essentially, if you remember the old Shadow radio series, anything which might cloud men's minds. So anything which might cloud men's minds so they couldn't achieve salvation has to be stamped out. Sin. The mind clouding was as follows. Liquor, demon rum, has to be stamped out. Obviously, liquor can cloud your mind, okay? Whether it's permanent or not, that's another story. So liquor's got to be stamped out. 2, anything on Sunday except going to church and reading the Bible has got to be stamped out. Any Sabbath activities whatsoever. And Sabbath is often broadly defined as Sunday plus Saturday night to make sure nobody can enjoy themselves ever. And third, the Roman Catholic Church, of course, is the agent of Satan, the agent of the Antichrist. So these are the 3 major things that have to be stamped out. And the public policy on the state and local level and federal level of the evangelicals for 100 years centered on these problems, these questions. On the state and local, on the immigration level, you try to keep out Catholic immigrants. They realize it's unconstitutional to do that, so they try to keep out immigrants, period, or else what they call Christianize the Catholics. Have a public school system, a compulsory education, so force the Catholic kids into the public schools so they can be Christianized. Turn into Protestants. The Catholic adults are considered damned anyway. Who cares about them? You get the kids. So that was on the immigration front. On liquor, of course, you have to stamp out liquor. And the Catholic Church, and Sabbath activities. On slavery is also sinful because slavery interfered with the salvation of the slave. That was it. The abolitionists had nothing to do with human rights or anything like that. It was essentially a theological point. So, this was their activity of these people for 100 years, or 30 years until the Civil War. Now, of course, in this coalition was first the Whig Party and then particularly the Republican Party, which was founded as an evangelical party. The Republican Party was known throughout the 19th century as the party of great moral ideas, which means stamping out sin, of course. Okay? Using the government to stamp out sin. The Democratic Party was known as the party of personal liberty, which meant they were favorable. The Democratic Party consists of everybody except evangelicals. Okay? In other words, Catholics, Lutherans, High Church Lutherans, secularists, Southerners weren't part of this at all. No, everybody else who wanted to be left alone were Democrats, and the high moral idea people, the crusaders of fire and sword, were the Republicans. So, in this coalition, so that's why the Northern War against the South took on a fanatical tinge to it. A cheerful willingness to uproot institutions, to crush, to kill, to plunder, to loot, to target women, as Tom Fleming pointed out. All in the name of high moral principle and the perfect world coming up. That's why they could take the high moral ground, because they're creating a perfect world, the kingdom of God on earth. The communists, in their way in the 20th century, are quite similar. They thought they're creating a perfect world. Sure, you have to kill 30 million people. I mean, intelligent communists. Yeah. But it's worth it to create the perfect world. a sort of atheist version of the kingdom of God on earth. So, we had then the Yankee fanatics were true Pattersonian humanitarians with the guillotine, Jacobins, Anabaptists, Bolsheviks, the whole bit, all in different forms and doing the same thing. And of course, now we find the reason for the pseudo-biblical phraseology of the Yankee culture, of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which summed up. It said that a really blasphemous Battle Hymn of the Republic, which really sums up the secularized version of sacralized version of secular cause, of making a purely secular cause into a holy crusade. It's a perfect evangelical doctrine, Puritan doctrine. So the modern left liberal historians put this in a slightly different way. Take, for example, the eminent abolitionist historian of the Civil War, James McPherson. Somebody mentioned him today too. McPherson, in a recent book review, he uses the Isaiah Berlin phony distinction between negative liberty and positive liberty. We're in favor of liberty, we're in favor of both negative and positive. Negative liberty means people like myself in favor of Bill of Rights, against intervention, things like that. So here's McPherson's positive liberty is empowerment. Okay? So, negative liberty, says McPherson, as I say, he means liberty. Negative liberty was a dominant theme in early American history. Freedom from constraints on individual rights imposed by a powerful state. The Bill of Rights, he goes on, is the classic expression of negative liberty, or Jeffersonian humanistic liberalism. These first 10 amendments of the Constitution, he says, protect individual liberties by placing a straitjacket of shall nots on the federal government. Yes. In 1861, McPherson continues, Southern states invoked the negative liberties of state sovereignty and individual rights of property to break up the United States. Now, what was McPherson's hero, Abraham Lincoln's response? Lincoln, he writes, quote, thereby gained an opportunity to invoke the positive liberty, he means, of course, statism and semi-socialism, the positive liberty of reform liberalism, exercised through the power of the army and the state, the humanitarian with the guillotine again, to overthrow the negative liberties of disunion and ownership of slaves. The interesting thing is, of course, McPherson says he's in favor of a blend of both. There is no blend of both, either one or the other. Of course, what he's really in favor of is reform liberalism. Another new model army at work. The Union Army is another new model army. So this is, because it seems to me pretty clear, the more the reform liberalism powers one group, the more you're interfering with the so-called negative liberties of another group. It should be mentioned, by the way, that slavery, the southern United States is the only place in the Western Hemisphere where slavery was abolished by the terrible swift sword. Every other place in the Western Hemisphere it was abolished peacefully by peaceful compensation of slaveholders. This includes the West Indies and Brazil and every place else. So we did not need a civil war, a terrible, monstrous war to get rid of slavery. But we needed it if we wanted to have the Puritan millennialists at work, imposing the kingdom of God on earth by fire and sword and plunder. Okay, in the Republican Party, in this mighty coalition, we're more or less dedicated to this triad. There were different parts of the coalition, different people stressing different things. At the faithful Republican convention of 1860, for example, the major candidates for president were the two veteran abolitionists, William Seward of New York and Salmon P. Chase of Ohio. Seward, however, was distrusted by the anti-Catholic hotheads. He wasn't anti-Catholic. He was almost pro-Catholic. So he was distrusted by everybody else. So that killed him off. Chase, on the other hand, was very happy to play along with the anti-Catholic know-nothings. He loved them. On the other hand, he meant he would lose any kind of sort of moderate German Lutheran vote. So he was distrusted by the Sewardites. So they knocked each other off, and a dark horse was nominated, Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was able to finesse the Catholic question because his major emphasis was on economic statism. He was an old-fashioned Whig. His big shtick was high tariffs, partnership of government and industry, subsidies to big railroads, public works, all the rest of it, sort of a proto-New Dealer. So he was the compromise candidate. The other people didn't care that much about the economic stuff. They were willing to go along with it. Abraham Lincoln, who was Lincoln, by the way? The idea was a rail splitter. It's sort of like Bill Clinton being a heroic figure or something like that. It's true he used to be a rail splitter, I guess, when he was 18 years old, but for his adult life, he was a big shot railroad lawyer. He was the candidate of the Illinois Central Railroad, the biggest railroad of the time. He was Mr. Railroad. Okay. So, and one reason for his victory at the convention was, for example, that Iowa railroad entrepreneur Grenville Dodge, it's one of my favorite stories about the Civil War. Grenville Dodge was a railroad entrepreneur in Iowa. He helped swing the Iowa delegation to Lincoln. It was touch and go. In return for this, early in the Civil War, Lincoln makes him a general, And his task was to take a whole bunch of Union soldiers to clear the path of Indians, and nothing to do with the South, clear the path of Indians so they could construct the Union Pacific Railroad, which was chartered by Lincoln, the first big federal government charter railroad, heavily subsidized by the taxpayer. And so he cleared the path. In other words, the Union Pacific Railroad was able to socialize the cost of construction by using the U.S. Army, the conscript army, to wipe out Indians. And then Grenville Dodge, having done his constructive work, retires from the Army and becomes one of the owners of the Union Pacific Railroad. That was the Dodge-Lincoln connection. It was the military-industrial complex at full blast. So, and this is the Republican Party was shot through with this stuff. The whole Lincoln and Grant administration, essentially one big boodle after the other. One big, enormous boodle. Unbelievably racket. Anyway, his major focus was on enforcing a protective tariff. Another reason he got nominated was the Pennsylvania delegation was mostly interested in protective tariff. They, of course, were abolitionists and all that, but their big thing was protective tariff. Pennsylvania was the home of the iron and steel industry from almost, early 1815 on. The iron and steel industry is my least favorite industry in America. It's been always inefficient. Ever since its existence, always calling for protective tariff or subsidies for import quotas. They're always bowling for federal aid. And so they essentially ran Pennsylvania, the Republican Party. And so, since he was sound on the tariff question, Pennsylvania vote went to Lincoln. And as Lou Rockwell pointed out, the first thing that Lincoln did was Lincoln Congress did was to raise the tariff to its highest point in American history, the moral tariff. And the tariff was raised 10 times after that during the Lincoln administration. And again, on Fort Sumter, interesting enough, as again Lou also pointed out, the point of Fort Sumter was, and Lincoln said in his first inaugural, well, slavery you don't care about. We got to collect those taxes, the southern taxes, you see, from southern ports. Charleston, New Orleans were two big southern ports. Fort Sumter was guarding Charleston Harbor, and he wanted to keep Fort Sumter to collect those tariffs. And of course, he then maneuvered the South into firing the first shot at Fort Sumter. But the tariffs and taxes were a key point for Lincoln and the Republican Party. Lying to South Carolina, Abraham Lincoln managed to do what Franklin Roosevelt and Henry Stimson did at Pearl Harbor 80 years later, maneuvering the Southerners into firing the first shot. By doing that, by the way, he ended the idea. There was a strong movement in the Middle North for a third Confederacy. Many of the states, Maryland, much of Pennsylvania, even New York City, Connecticut, they didn't like either side. They wanted to form their own confederation. Get out of the Union. They hated the Yankees too. Everybody hated the Yankees. Get out of Yankeedom. Let them have their damn New England, northern Illinois area. So, unfortunately, by maneuvering the Southerners to firing Fort Sumter, that movement for a third Confederacy was collapsed. But I honor the Copperheads. To me, the Copperheads are one of the great groups in American history. The Copperheads were the pro-Southern Northerners were against the war, wanted to negotiate a peace. My particular hero was Charles O'Connor, who was an Irish Catholic, the head of the New York City Bar, distinguished lawyer. He was Jefferson Davis's lawyer for his treason trial, which never came about after the war. And he was a libertarian, paleo-libertarian to the hilt. He was a great guy, and he was of course very anti-war. New York City almost seceded from the North during the war. Mayor Fernando Wood wanted to secede and free trade with the South. There was a sound sentiment. There was big draft riots in New York to attack the draft, which went on for days. Another heroic libertarian gesture. So and by the way, Charles O'Connor, toward the end of his life, when the Democratic Party, his beloved party, picked Horace Greeley of all things, an idiot and a socialist and a protectionist, picked Horace Greeley as the presidential candidate. Connor formed a straight Democrat ticket in 1972, ran for president. Nobody's ever written on this. I don't think one historian has ever written on this great ticket. At any rate, so that's Lincoln and what else did the Republican Party do when they took over? In addition to butchery, of course, they took advantage of the more or less one-party Congress to push through the entire Whig Republican economic program. High tariffs, I've said already, huge railroad land grants, railroad subsidies, sin taxes on alcohol and tobacco at the beginning. That's the Puritan motif. You can't imagine how cheap liquor was before the Civil War. You can't imagine it. A gallon of good scotch for 20 cents or something. Forget about price inflation. It was magnificent. He ruined that. The income tax for the first time in American history, the monstrous income tax levied by Lincoln, And of course, paper money, the fiat money, and nationalizing the banking system, every rotten thing you could think of was done by Lincoln. Plus the conscription comes in a huge scale, massive conscription to get these people to fight. The right of habeas corpus was suspended, arrest of dissenters, civil liberties were attacked, everything else. The whole thing was absolutely monstrous. When I heard, by the way, it's interesting, when I heard that my old friend, the late Mel Bradford, was denied the post of National Endowment for Humanities chairman early in the Reagan administration because he was anti-Lincoln, which made him a fascist. I couldn't believe, what do you mean? Lincoln was the first big fascist. What are they doing him that? So, on the religion, I just want to say about Lincoln, on the religious front, I don't think Lincoln was very religious. But he went along with the culture. He was apparently very sober and stern. He was personally opposed to alcohol and tobacco. And he was opposed to the private carrying of guns, by the way, one of the first gun controllers. He was also, of course, running for president since almost his early adulthood. He also acted viciously toward his own humble family in Kentucky. He repudiated his entire family. He used to have anything to do with them. He dumped his fiancée to marry a wealthier girl, Mary Todd, whose family were friends of Henry Clay, coming up here with the guillotine. He repudiates his own family, but then the whole world becomes his family, right? The Union becomes his God, mystical union. As a matter of fact, he prefigured our own beloved Mario Cuomo in New York by declaring the Union was really a family, bound indissolubly together by the most intimate organic bonds. He repudiates his own family, and he takes the Union, this non-existent thing out there, as his family. This is, I think, typical of liberals, liberalism in action. That's what it is. So, and the difference, I think, between the British and the North, again, the British were at least loyal to an existing person, the king. That was there, was at least coherent. The North was loyal, engaged in this monstrous war of plunder and mass murder and destruction and assault of women and all the rest of it, in allegiance to a mystical, non-existent entity, the Union, which was totally illogical, totally absurd. This becomes the god of the North. There is no heresy greater and no political theory more pernicious than sacralizing the secular, make a secular institution a divine entity. So this is, to conclude, the war, in this war between the states, it seems clear to me that the South fought for its sacred honor, no question about that, for an honorable war. The Northern War, however, was very opposite of honorable. Remember the care about international law. The North targeted civilians, and targeted women and targeted civilians. First off, it destroyed civilian life, it destroyed civilian institutions. Sherman's infamous march through Georgia, which is part of it, just the most famous part of this. The idea is to starve and kill the South into submission. So by targeting and butchering civilians, Lincoln and Grant and Sherman paved the way for all the genocidal horrors of the monstrous 20th century. There's been a lot of talk in recent years about memory, about never forgetting, capital N, capital F, about history's retroactive punishment for crimes of war and mass murder. The great libertarian historian Lord Acton put it, the historian in the last analysis must be a moral judge. The muse of the historian, he wrote, is not Cleo, but Rhadamanthus, the legendary avenger of innocent blood. All right, in that spirit, we must always remember, we must never forget, we must put it in the dock and hang higher than Haman, those who in modern times opened the Pandora's box of genocide and extermination of civilians, Sherman, Grant, and Lincoln. Perhaps someday their statues, like Lenin's in Russia, will be toppled and melted down. Their insignias and battle flags will be desecrated, their war songs tossed into the flame. And then Davis and Lee and Jackson and Forrest and all the heroes of the South, Dixie and the Stars and Bars will once again be truly honored and remembered. The classic comment on that meretricious TV series, that rotten series of Civil War, was made by that marvelous and feisty great Southern writer Florence King, one of my favorite writers. Asked her views on the series, she replied, "I didn't have time to watch the Civil War. I'm too busy getting ready for the next one." In that spirit, I'm sure that one day, aided and abetted by Northerners like myself and the glorious Copperhead tradition, the South shall rise again. Thank you.